Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. And just like that, you'll find our live feed here that actually runs all day from New York to Washington, D.C., and everything in between. All the shows you hear on the radio are on YouTube, and we invite you, as always, to join us here in the studio. Big news on CPI Day. That's where we start. And boy, the overlap with politics seems to be getting heavier by the minute. Keep in mind, today, Donald Trump's going to roll out his economic plan, at least as billed by the campaign. On Friday, Kamala Harris is going to do the same thing on the eve of the Democratic National Convention. Where are we on taxes? Where are we on so many questions, including an approach to the Federal Reserve and, of course, the almighty cost of goods? Is there any sunlight between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden? We'll find out, I guess, Friday. And the fact is, maybe it doesn't matter because the news keeps looking pretty good, at least if you're looking for the opportunity, maybe between now and November, to declare victory in the fight over inflation. Stuart Paul must be getting excited listening to this. He's with us right now on the CPI Day, live from New York, Bloomberg Economics U.S. Economist. Great to see you, Stuart. The headline, pretty encouraging if your name is Kamala Harris. Core inflation eases a fourth month, sealing a Fed rate cut. What else do we need to know?
It was a pretty good report for the Fed. Headline inflation came in just a touch lower than folks expected. That allowed annual inflation to cool to 2.9% from 3%. As you said, that's definitely good news for Kamala Harris, who is being painted largely with the same brush in terms of attribution of economic outcomes as President Biden has been painted with. Within the CPI report, and one of the reasons why this is good news for the Fed, a lot of the things that people finance and the things that have prices that are very much so directly affected by Fed policy, things like cars, things like appliances and televisions, all of those are seeing price declines. Where there still are inflationary pressures are in a lot of the categories that the Fed can't entirely control, or at least not very directly. So still seeing a lot of inflation pressures in rents and home prices, due in large part to a decade of underbuilding. The Biden administration is trying to combat that, issuing an $100 million grant to support new home construction. That is just a drop in the bucket when we think about $46 trillion in residential real estate wealth in the country. But again, it's home price pressures and pressures in rent that's supporting inflation. Also seeing a lot of inflation in auto insurance. And you could end up seeing that attributed to corporate greed out on the campaign trail. That's a common refrain that we've heard from Kamala Harris. But this is really largely a story of catch-up inflation. We saw the run-up in auto prices when cars were in short supply during the pandemic. When the replacement cost of autos gets higher, so too will insurance premiums. That's a lot of what's buoying inflation right now.
Auto insurance. This is really interesting, and I'm glad that you pointed out, Stuart, the matter of shelter costs, because even if this economy is going into a slowdown, that doesn't seem to be impacting what we're paying to live. And it's interesting, the jump in shelter, the largest category within services, didn't matter if you were talking about ownership or rent. Am I reading that right? Both are up 0.4 after going up in June here. This is going to be very difficult for anybody running for office to get to.
That's right. The thing that folks need to keep in mind is that mortgage rates were brought down below 3% when the Fed cut rates down to the bone following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. When everybody refinanced their mortgage, it now makes it basically prohibitively expensive for them to list their homes and move. So again, homes are still in short supply. Exactly. So homes are still in short supply, and so we're still seeing those pressures on both home ownership costs and on rents. And again, politicians can try to combat that as best as they can, but it's going to be difficult after a decade of underbuilding.
We got a statement from the White House today, and you can almost don't even look down. Just tell me what you think it says, because that second paragraph starts the same way every month. It doesn't seem to matter how good the news is. Prices are still too high, period. This is a White House that is desperate to not be caught in the act of celebrating. Could that change between now and the election? I mean, we're noting in the statement inflation has fallen below 3%. Core inflation, lowest level since April 21. When can this White House, or God forbid Kamala Harris, say we made it?
It's going to be really tough. It's going to be really tough to declare victory while at the same time recognizing that over the past 4 years, overall prices have increased over 20%. So the purchasing power of the cash that folks have had in their savings account is now reduced by a fifth relative to where they were when the Biden administration took office. It's not the administration's fault solely. Of course, again, rates were cut to the bone. We had stimulus and multiple rounds of direct checks distributed under both Trump and Biden. We had tax reform under Trump. This isn't this isn't a consequence solely of Biden-era policies, but it did take place on his watch. And if you were to just simply use, say, the Ray Fair model of predicting election outcomes, Kamala Harris would end up with just about a 48-49% share of the two-party poll. I'm interested to hear what we're going to hear in the next segment about her polling in Florida, but and just how much she's going to bear that burden of responsibility for economic outcomes. But it would be a little bit tone deaf to say that that victory has been achieved in the fight against inflation.
I think I've succeeded in turning Stuart Paul into a political analyst. What do you think? Bloomberg Economics, U.S. economist. Stuart, great to see you. And thank you on a CPI day. This is important stuff. And we're going to move right into retail sales later this week. There are going to be more data points, certainly before we get to Jackson Hole and a Fed meeting in September. But the trajectory appears to be in place here, underscoring the argument for a cut in September. Just more a question of how big it's going to be. Keeping tabs on the trail here, we've been talking about this through the eyes of the campaign. Donald Trump will be fleshing out his economic plans. 4 p.m., Asheville, North Carolina. And we'll, of course, let you know on the late edition of Balance of Power what he's talking about here, essentially preempting or trying to Kamala Harris's big speech on Friday. They're both doing it in North Carolina. She's going to be in Raleigh with her economic proposals. Today, though, she's off and running with Joe Biden. And you know they're going to be talking about the cost of goods, inflation. This keeps coming up. It's the number one issue. What are your plans for the economy as we face a slowdown here in a world of interest rate cuts instead of hikes? Bringing us to the swing state of Florida with a smirk is David Paleologos. It's been some time since we've had a chance to talk with the man behind the Suffolk University Political Research Center. And everybody's talking about you, David, this week because of this Florida poll that you guys put up, making us all wonder, what the heck is this map actually going to look like once the race settles here coming out of Chicago? Welcome back to Bloomberg, David. It's good to have you. I don't want to just dwell completely on Florida, but that is why you're in the news this week. And I just wonder, as you hear the conversation we're coming out of here on the economy, Trump speaks today, Kamala Harris on Friday. How important are these economic plans going to be for getting to folks who haven't made up their mind yet?
Well, the timing is really interesting. You know, in the poll, we looked at people who said the economy or inflation was the number one issue. And in Florida, Trump was beating Harris just among those voters by 30 points, 60 to 30 in Florida. And in immigration, voters who say immigration is the most important issue, Trump was winning 86 to 6. So Kamala Harris has drawn a lot of criticism for not doing Q&A and press availability. But I think what's going on is, since she got the nomination, she's doing research to figure out what her plan is going to be separate from Joe Biden and how she can sort of couch that difference and thread the needle.
Interesting. Had a conversation with Democratic pollster Celinda Lake. I always picture you guys in your own special club here. You must have a secret handshake or something. And she was talking about this idea of Kamala Harris making Florida viable, making it competitive. David, here's what she said.
The Harris campaign is very disciplined. We stay focused on the battleground states. Trying to go into Florida is like trying to go into Western Europe. It's so many media markets. It's so expensive. This is a team that will keep their eye on the prize. We have our 7 battleground states. We're going to win those states, and we're going to concentrate on them.
So, David, tell us what you are learning in the Sunshine State here and how much attention we should be paying to states like Florida that aren't part of the swing states that most polls are focused on.
Yeah, so what we picked up, and this poll was done August 7th to the 11th, so it's pretty, the ink is still pretty dry on this one, is, it's closer. Like, going into this poll, like, you have to separate yourself from being a pollster and just a voter. I was looking at this not thinking it was going to be a close race for a bunch of different reasons. Florida's purged a million Democratic voters since 2020 off the rolls, such that the active voter count is plus 1 million for Republicans. So I didn't really expect it to be close, but it is. And the reason it is because Kamala Harris has opened up a 12-point lead among women, and to kind of offset the 24-point lead among men that Trump has, and she's winning independents. So she still has a long way to go. There's only 3% undecided, so a 5-point lead for Trump in Florida looks pretty solid. And then it opens up the whole question of RFK, who's got the biggest block of votes after, Trump and Harris at 5%. And I don't think he's going to end up with 5%. So the question is, where are those voters going to roll to?
Well, you just said a lot, and I want to unpack some of this. 5-point difference here in Florida. That in itself is news. I think we can argue, and you do have a 4.4% margin of error, just to give you a sense of what that actually looks like here. David, where was Joe Biden against Trump in Florida?
Oh, far. I mean, it was like night and day. What we've seen with Joe Biden is he had just low enthusiasm. Even in our most recent national poll, there was a difference of people being excited for Joe Biden versus very excited for Donald Trump. It was a 20-point difference. Now in Florida, it's pretty much wiped out. The amount of people who say they're voting for Kamala Harris are excited almost equally as they are for Donald Trump. So that's off the table, the excitement advantage that Trump had over Biden.
Fascinating. So you mentioned third parties, RFK. You combine third-party voters with so-called double haters. And this is the mushy middle here, right? This is the area that these candidates can actually maybe pick off some votes, David. How large is that pool when you put them together?
It's really large. When you're talking about percentage points, and now we're talking about a 5-point lead, not a 15-point lead. So it's an amazing dynamic to dissect. I mean, RFK was winning 10% of no party affiliations or independents. 10%. He was winning 12% of black voters in Florida. He's winning 17% of independent women that Kamala Harris really needs to win over. She already has a fairly big lead among independent women, but RFK was winning 17% of them. So when you look at RFK dropping, and you're seeing some of these percentages potentially rotating to Kamala Harris, that potentially could see even a closer race. That doesn't mean that she's going to win. It just means that way the dynamics are, it's a closer race than you would think.
Spending time with David Paleologos at Suffolk University Political Research Center. David, will Kamala Harris get a traditional convention bump out of Chicago next week?
I think you have to expect it. I mean, we have to look at history. And, and if that's the case, then her lead in the national polls will probably jump a couple of points to maybe +7 or +8. And then some of the swing states, maybe +5, 6. And I think that's why the Florida polls make sense to me. You've got that dynamic going on nationally and in the swing states. And, in Florida, a lot of people don't realize this, but Florida has a ballot question on legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana. That's going to drive out young people. They have an abortion rights question, statewide abortion rights question, which is going to drive up women, which will then by default will help Kamala Harris's campaign. So when you're polling, you kind of have to take each cycle and the dynamics that are going on in each state into account, and we're picking that up in the polling.
David, I had to chuckle this morning. I was reading the Politico out of the State House in Boston, And apparently the governor and lieutenant governor, Maura Healey and lieutenant governor, will be in Chicago attending the festivities next week. And your state auditor is going to be in control of the government while they're gone?
Yeah, hold on to your wallet, I guess, with the state auditor being in control. I wouldn't want to be managing any of the state agencies at this time. But,
to be king for a day.
I expected Healey. I mean, it makes sense to me what Healey offers to the National Democratic ticket. Lieutenant Governor is surprised a little bit. But, everybody, I don't know her personally, but everybody that, who I talk to speak very highly of the lieutenant governor as well. So it's just
one of the progressive celebrities in Chicago. Hey, David, it's great to have you back. David Paleologos, Suffolk University Research Center, with the latest on the trail. Even in Florida, the numbers are moving. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
The fastest show in politics live right now on Bloomberg Radio, on your satellite radio, and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live to find us there. We've got the cameras up in the studio, and we welcome you always. Here in our first hour, about to talk about not only the campaign, which we've been invested in, and this CPI day with the intersection of politics and the economy. Donald Trump today rolling out his economic plan ahead of Kamala Harris doing the same on Friday. But one of the most important stories that's developing before our eyes here is one that is not getting enough coverage. And a couple of months ago would have been our lead story here for days on end, I'm sure. And that is Ukraine's incursion into Russia, going on the offensive in the Kursk region, as we've discussed here. And they are not turning back. Story on the terminal says it all. Russia says its air defenses had quite a night, shooting down 117 drones and 4 tactical missiles in one of the largest overnight attacks of this war since it began. The defense ministry in Moscow says its forces destroyed unmanned aerial vehicles over almost all regions bordering Ukraine. This is a remarkable moment we're in here. By the way, a Russian Su-34 fighter bomber was apparently also shot down in the Kursk region. If you're with us on YouTube, showing you a map now of that region in yellow here. If you're listening on the radio, this is northeastern Ukraine into Russia. And a pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Grant as we seek insights on what's happening and what might happen next. National security analyst and senior fellow at the Lexington Institute. Dr. Grant, it's great to see you on Bloomberg. Thank you for giving us some of your time today. Broadly speaking here, Ukraine has been pretty quiet about this. It was only in the last 24 hours President Zelensky confirmed what was going on. How important is this foothold across the border going to be for Ukraine?
This is very, very important. And the Kursk pocket proves, first of all, that Ukraine is still very much in this fight. As you said, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, it looked like the war was locked in a stalemate. Of course, that is still true along the eastern and the southern front. But Ukraine, with this surprise flank attack, has really opened up a new chapter. And very interesting to me that the White House is absolutely fine with this. So this Ukrainian offensive into Russia is going on with more than tacit approval from the United States and also from other NATO allies.
So how does Ukraine turn this into a foothold? How long can they hold this area? Can they expand it?
Well, that is the perfect question of what happens now. And because of the operational security around Ukraine's operation, we are going to just be guessing and watching YouTube and watching the map to see what happens. What we know so far is this incursion is about 45 miles deep and about 20 miles wide. They've been able to do it using vehicles like the U.S.-made Stryker and others to move very, very quickly. Got to mention, it shows that Ukraine's forces have been very well trained by several NATO partners, and that they're really very, very capable. They're also rotating forces up to the battle edge and then back out. Very professional. But the question now is, are they going for a particular objective? Will they then consolidate? Or at some point, will they pull back? What we know is that Zelensky has said he doesn't intend to take and hold territory inside Russia. But what we don't know is how close Ukraine is to reaching their operational objectives with this invasion. We're really moving into the second week now. They may be going further north, perhaps towards a nuclear power plant, or maybe they've already made their point. We'll see.
We've seen Russian civilians, tens of thousands, evacuate that area. And it made many of us ask the question what Vladimir Putin might be preparing as he gets Russian citizens out of the way in a potential retaliatory strike against the Ukrainian military. But I know your specialty is in air power, air defense. Ukraine has F-16s now. I don't know how well trained these pilots are, but we're told they have U.S. munitions. Will those F-16s help to protect Ukrainians on the ground in Russia?
Good question. The F-16s are certainly helping to protect Ukraine. Are they doing a combined arms operation with the Ukrainian forces in Russia? You know, we simply don't know. We have seen a couple video clips of Ukraine Air Force weapons detonation in that Kursk pocket, but we don't know what the platform is. As to the F-16 pilots in Ukraine, you know, how well trained are they? Hey, these are really, really good pilots. First of all, they came in as experienced aviators with combat experience, and they've been through the F-16 schoolhouse. So they know not only how to fly the F-16, but how to employ it as a weapon system. And the F-16, of course, has incredible air-to-air capabilities, but mostly we're talking about air-to-ground attack and the ability of the F-16 to target Russian air defenses, including the air defenses that have been converted into ground-to-ground strike missiles for the Russians. So the F-16s definitely are opening a new chapter, and we're seeing some combined arms work between air power and ground formations in the Kursk pocket.
Spending time with Dr. Rebecca Grant at the Lexington Institute. I want to turn your attention, Rebecca, to the Middle East now. I know you're doing a lot of work for us today, but we're waiting for a retaliatory strike, possibly, maybe not, by Iran against Israel, to the point where the U.S. has been surging a lot of extra hardware into the region, not just the guided missile subs or the aircraft carrier strike group that have been making headlines, but more F-22s to stand by for whatever might happen. And remembering the April attack by Iran, the drone attack, the missile attack into Israel, we saw American pilots shooting down missiles and drones from U.S. fighter jets. Are we going to see that again with these F-22s if Iran decides to strike?
Oh, 100%. If Iran tries another big attack with, 300 objects like they did back in April. So the tactical problem is this. It's about 1,000 miles from Tehran to Tel Aviv. That's a big swath of airspace. And so U.S. Central Command is guarding that by using land-based fighters like the F-22s that have been surged into theater. And let me tell you, that I think is the biggest combat deployment of F-22s that we've ever seen. Already there was the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier with her air wing, which as far as I can tell is doing 24/7 operations. So they monitor this airspace. I believe Jordan is probably helping out because Jordan, of course, borders over in that other side of the airspace. So we have to be able to watch the airspace using missile defense systems and then using the fighter aircraft to be able to chase down and intercept, particularly in this case, the Iran's rather slow-flying drones. They are incredibly vulnerable. So you're an F-22 pilot and your cockpit display is showing you a whole lot of Iranian targets in the air if Iran tries a similar type of strike.
What an incredible image that you're painting here. Rebecca, this is direct engagement we're talking about with Americans. It's the equivalent of boots on the ground in the sky in this case. What would that mean if one of our air crews was knocked out of the sky, if this became more complex in our effort to protect Israel?
Well, you're right. It is boots in the sky. Believe me, the fighter pilots have their own boots, and they fly in boots, and it is boots in the sky. First of all, there's always a search and rescue plan in place. But more importantly, we've deployed our top-of-the-line systems, F-22s, F-35Cs. Actually, it's a Marine squadron heading into the region, and other F-15Es and other fighters in place. So the idea is to have enough superiority and enough visibility in the battle space. And by that, I mean F-22 and others are looking to see where Iran's air defenses pop up. They can see when something goes hot on their screen and give warning to others in the strike package. And of course, then attack and neutralize it if necessary. So using that great stealth and situation awareness should make this an airspace where the U.S. and allies can be absolutely dominant. That's the point of bringing in all our first-line weapons.
So you're clearly not worried about the potential for an escalatory standoff here by putting American service members, in this case, airmen and sailors, Marines, in a direct confrontation with unmanned weapons from Iran.
Well, make no mistake, the U.S. has deployed enough so that they actually have some good strike options available. And by that, I mean the ability to attack Houthi targets in Yemen, the ability to attack targets in Iran if that becomes necessary, and then to strike back against any other Iran-backed militia. So deploying enough to have offensive strike options is part of the deterrence equation. And this mass of high-level U.S. forces is meant to be squashing down Iran's tactical options. Hopefully that deters an attack. If not, it makes it much easier to defend against that. Might there be some retaliatory strikes by the U.S. depending on the circumstances? Well, yeah, they've got the firepower in theater to do it. But the goal is not to start a war. It's to maintain or reestablish deterrence.
Pretty remarkable. Just in our remaining moment, Doctor, the more time goes by, does that make it less likely that Iran strikes?
Only Iran knows. And we're hearing, remember, their president has only been in power for a few weeks. We're hearing about divisions. I'd like to think the crisis diminishes, but really only Iran knows about that decision. But boy, they are staring at a lot of U.S. and allied firepower right now.
Fascinating conversation, Doctor, and I really appreciate your joining us. Those of us who've been watching on YouTube have been admiring what has to be the coolest mantle photograph I've ever seen behind you. 1010 on the room radar, Doctor. Many thanks, and don't be a stranger. Dr. Rebecca Grant, National Security Analyst, Senior Fellow at the Lexington Institute, with our eyes on two theaters here and a lot of questions about what might happen in the coming days. Just consider, we're going to be in Chicago on Monday for the DNC. Could this be the backdrop of day one when Joe Biden addresses the delegates, with Iran dealing with Israel and the U.S. in the mix? We're going to have a lot more ahead. We'll assemble our political panel next, as you would expect, on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for being with us. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite and on YouTube, it's good to have you. You can always find us on YouTube, all of our shows throughout the day. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. Blammo, there's our live feed. We'll meet you there. On CPI Day, which seems to have more political connotation than ever as we move closer to the convention, closer to the election, closer to the debate, when prices for goods and services will be in the air. The smartest political analysis I read this morning after 8:30 came from Enda Curran. It was just one post on our Top Live blog, and it says it all. The fact of the matter is, fourth month of cooling inflation, great news for Kamala Harris, but both campaigns can find a lot to talk about in here. As I read on the blog from Enda, if you're on the Harris campaign team, you're probably breathing easier. The headline takeaway, inflation continues to ease. That's the easy part, right? Fed cut next month. But if you're the Trump campaign, you will not lose time highlighting the ongoing sting from housing costs. Remember, we talked about shelter costs with Stuart Paul. Car insurance, he also highlighted it. And other staples, the fodder for each side of the aisle. So everybody's happy today in the world of politics, and I'm glad to say Enda Curran is with us right now, Bloomberg Global Economics reporter. Good to see you. You've got a real political mind as you look at this data. I sort of think of you that way. And that's the way we have to be reading this stuff now, isn't it?
I think we have to be at this stage of the election cycle, as you know so well, Joe. All the polls have told us that the economy has been top of mind for people. Cost of living has been top of mind for people. Now we have this inflation data for July. Like you say, headline number is pretty good, suggesting the Fed and the policymakers are turning a corner with inflation. Yep. Prices coming down for apparel, for airfares, prices coming down for new and used cars. There's good news there, inflation coming off the boil. But to your point, I mean, within that big sting in the tail with rents still going up. Rents weren't meant to be going up at this pace by now. The hope was that they would be turning off. And then other daily staples like car insurance. You buy a cheap car, but you're going to pay a fortune on car insurance. Yep. Plenty of sting in the tail there. So yes, the point is good news on a headline basis. Of course, the administration will welcome that. But if you're in the opposition, you're in the Trump campaign, plenty for you to ride home on too.
You remember there was a presidential campaign wrapped around this whole thing at one point. Why? Because the rent is too damn high. Does Donald Trump start talking about this? Shelter costs are a real thing, and a lot of young people can relate with it.
Of course they are, and housing costs, very real. I mean, it varies around the country, of course, but certainly the housing market has been in something of a funk now for the past 2 years. Investors aren't willing to invest and develop property. People aren't willing to sell their homes. There's sort of an inventory problem. There's a high rent story. There's a lot going on there. So yes, you would say it's good fertile political ground for anyone to harvest. Yeah. But you would imagine maybe Vice President Harris too might come out with some ideas of her own. As you know, she has her speech coming up this week. So sure. she may also use that as an opportunity to lay out her stall.
I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to talk to our panel about this next. Donald Trump talks today, and we've heard his plan is largely to get at it through energy. Drill, baby, drill. He says you bring energy prices lower and everything else follows. Some voters want to hear a little more than that. I know investors do. And you wonder, to what extent will Kamala Harris be able to show any sunlight between herself and Joe Biden on this issue?
Well, politically, I mean, she has to make that calculation. How far can she push from it? But on the ground, to your point, people would probably love to hear some solutions in terms of how do you slow the increase in rent? How do you increase supply in housing? I mean, 90% of the inflation increase today was because of the whole shelter story. So I think people on the ground of any stripe are open to solutions in terms of easing up the housing story. And in other aspects of cost of living too, how do you tackle what's going on in car insurance, for example? How can you keep an eye on companies who are price gouging? There's lots of territory there for both candidates. It's a question of just how they want to sell that to the public, so to speak.
That's right. Helping us get our arms around the most important issue on the trail. Enda Curran. Thank you, Enda. Great to see you, as always, Bloomberg Global Economy reporter, connecting the dots for us here as we assemble our political panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, Democratic strategist and political science professor at Iona University, and Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist, founder of Espina and Company. Great to see you both, and thanks for joining the conversation. Brittany, I'll start with you because Donald Trump is up first here. We're going to hear from both candidates on their economic plans this week. Does he need to say more today than drill, baby, drill?
I do think he needs to say more than that, and also just stay on message. I think he needs to stop talking about crowd sizes, wondering what race or nationality, the vice president is, or race, I should say, and really focus on, what he did when he was president. A lot of people, whether you like Trump or not, a lot of people aren't happy with the economy under Biden, and they feel that they were in a better spot under Trump. And so he really needs to be able to hammer that point home and be able to connect with people on that level and not be just so erratic in his messaging all the time.
Jeanne, there was a poll that I think so far is an outlier from the Financial Times earlier this week, and we talked about it when it was released, suggesting that more people actually trust Kamala Harris when it comes to handling the economy than Donald Trump. But every other poll, including our own swing state poll, shows a wide lead for Trump on who do you trust to handle the economy, interest rates, the cost of goods, the cost of services. She's going to have to remove herself from Joe Biden on this issue to make a difference, won't she?
She will. And, you were just talking about the Suffolk poll. You look at that, obviously, Florida, but Donald Trump winning amongst people who say the economy is the most important issue by something like 30 points. And, we see that across the nation. As much as the Financial Times poll really got Democrats happy and excited, and they seem to be moving in the right direction. On the economy and on immigration, Donald Trump is still winning by large numbers. And so to Brittany's point, if he can stay on message, that would be very helpful to the campaign. The problem has been he has been way off message. I mean, I listened to the Musk interview. We had 40 minutes on the assassination attempt and much less on how his economic policy and plans and record, because he has one, is different than Kamala Harris's. And so that is what he needs to do. And to your point, she needs to define herself. As much as she has been our vice president, most people still don't know a lot about Kamala Harris and what her plans are and who she is. So she's got, unlike Joe Biden, this window to define herself on the economy. And it's going to be critically important. I think what she says in Maryland with the president and then in North Carolina this week, critically important to the rest of the campaign, because the economy is it for most voters as they run to the polls in November.
And that's a tall order, Jeannie. I'm sure you would agree. I mean, this has been in the White House with Joe Biden since we came out of COVID, since inflation has been a story here. So to try to slice this thing into something different is going to be a real task. Brittany, the fact of the matter is Republicans have the goods here. You can talk about a fourth month of ongoing inflation, but there's a reason why the White House in its statement on the CPI today said prices are still too high. Republicans, Donald Trump, anybody, J.D. Vance can point to very specifically shelter costs. You've done nothing to help young people get a foothold in the housing market. Car insurance, the cost of vehicles themselves, even getting at the EV issue here, Brittany. Isn't this a grab bag for the Trump campaign?
It absolutely should be. I think that when Republicans are able to stay on message when it comes to these sorts of things, they're able to be successful. But again, the question is whether he's able to stay on message or not. He hasn't really been able to. And then when you look at his candidate, Senator Vance, he has also kind of been in these first few weeks as the choice, a chaotic choice, a chaotic candidate, right? I mean, he, I think, was the lowest ranking VP pick in the polls of all time. And that, you're right, there are so many things to point to. And if you happen to catch yesterday, Nikki Haley, she did an interview where she was saying Republicans need to stop whining and they need to start paying attention to these issues and talking about these issues, because this is what people care about. I think that when it comes to the debate in a few weeks here, we'll maybe see them on both sides really stick to those talking points. But we're a few weeks out and people are starting to pay attention, especially with the DNC convention coming up next week. So yes, I think there's more than enough here for Republicans, especially at the top of the ticket, to be talking about, but that's not the case, unfortunately, for them.
Talk about the convention for a moment here. Of course, we're going to be there Monday. 1 week from tonight, Jeannie, we've added another here to the list. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg lands a primetime slot on Wednesday night. This is Tim Walz night. And Harris and Walz also, we have learned, next week are going to plan a rally, not in Chicago, but in Milwaukee. They're going to use, it looks like, the very same convention hall that Donald Trump used in Milwaukee. What do you make of these updates to the agenda? And what does it tell us specifically about Pete Buttigieg landing a slot like that?
Yeah, I think it's smart for them to go to Milwaukee, right? You know, it's not far, right across the border. Wisconsin, as we know, a must-win state. So it does make sense. And heck, if you can take Donald Trump's tax policies on, say, tips for waiters and waitresses, why not go to his convention house? So there you go. You know, I do think the Buttigieg move makes good sense as well. Incredibly popular with the base. He is an up and coming star in the Democratic side. And so, you know, that's the kind of person you want. And Joe, I have to say, I think earlier you gave me an idea for somebody else. Jimmy McMillan, the rent is too damn high guy.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, as a New Yorker, we know him. He's, you know, the rent is too damn high for everybody. So get him out there at the convention along with the judge.
God, you just pulled that in. Jimmy McMillan. You think I'll have the gloves on, the leather gloves and the whole thing? The rent is too damn high party. Brittany, is there something there for Republicans to seize on?
Yeah, I mean, always, especially Trump. Look, we all know that Trump likes giving people nicknames. I think that would be a smart nickname to use as opposed to, all of the crazy ones that he's saying. But yeah, I mean, like I said, there's just so much here to pull from, and it's a matter of whether he can remain on messaging or not. And I think next week it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of the Democrats' convention. I agree with you, seeing that Buttigieg is sort of at a primetime spot shows that they care. That's what they want to be leaning into, not just now, but in the future. And they see him as a rising star in the party. I mean, obviously he is. He's been, from Mayor Pete to Department of Transportation, right? And I think, though, Republicans, if they're paying attention and tuning in, especially the Trump campaign, they should be. I'm sure they will be. Trump loves TV. Be able to use some of those things to help them with what they should be saying to the American people.
Producer Matt says it all. Jimmy McMillan, best facial hair in politics, not counting Ty Cobb. If that means something to you, you are truly a wonk. Would you try to counter-program the convention, Brittany, or should Donald Trump lay low, reset the clock next week?
I think resetting the clock would be helpful. Is it possible or probable? Probably not. But we did see, though, between the debate and the assassination attempt, there were a few weeks there where he was pretty under the radar. I think right now what I've seen is Trump who continues to spiral. When all these polls are coming out that now has a vice president ahead of him, especially out of the swing states, I think he needs to take a breath, take a beat, and just sort of reassess and just give his team an opportunity to sort of reframe what it is that they want to be saying, focusing on moving forward. I think that would be to his benefit. Yeah. Can he help himself? Who knows? Probably not. But we've seen him do it in the past. He can be more subdued and stay on message in those capacities.
Great panel today with Brittany Martinez and Jeanne Zaino.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Of course, as we watch the inflation picture unfolding before our eyes, think about how we are talking a lot about shelter, maybe less so about other volatile components like energy now. It does speak to the not stasis, but the relative more calm that seems to be in energy markets now. Yeah. For now, though, as we still are on watch to see whether or not there is actually an escalation in conflict in the Middle East, as we are still waiting to see if and when Iran and Hezbollah will actually retaliate against Israel.
It was crude oil, WTI, still just sitting there at $77 a barrel. Like none of this is happening.
Well, because right now, frankly, nothing really is happening. The question is that by design, or does that signal that actually maybe nothing will come for all of the talk and warning of it? So it's on this note now that we turn to Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He is former U.S. ambassador to the UN, former ambassador to Russia as well, U.S. ambassador to Russia, that is. Sir, it's always great to have you here. We would like to get your thoughts on Russia and Ukraine as well. But if we could just begin with what's happening in the Middle East, given that we have seen nothing yet from Iran or its proxies, does that just signal that they're delaying for what could be a larger attack than we saw in April, or that maybe they're considering not doing anything at all?
It's quite possible, and we've seen some statements on their part that they may, for reasons that are not yet clear, be holding off for any particular reason. It is certainly clear that the U.S. has sent a very stern and very tough message and wishes to avoid the outbreak of a conflict that begins to escalate and cascade in the region for very, very good reasons, having to do with, obviously, the safety and security of Israel on the one hand, to which the U.S. is committed, but also to the galloping death toll of Palestinians in Gaza, about which Vice President Harris has spoken out quite firmly recently.
Ambassador, we've seen the biggest mobilization of F-22 fighter jets into an area of combat that we have ever seen here. And I wonder if you're concerned or it gives you comfort to know that American airmen, sailors, and Marines will likely be directly involved in knocking down whatever Iran throws at Israel.
Joe, it has to be both. Obviously, anything that can deter, damp down any enthusiasm on the part of either party to launch a series of military actions which have the potential of cascading into a much broader conflict is very much in our interest. At the same time, obviously, any actions taken which precipitate that particular kind of activity are going to be clearly steps not in our interest, not in the region's interest, and not in the workout of the problems in the region, in the interest of those people who believe, as I do, that a ceasefire and hostage exchange are very much important questions, and that will come up tomorrow in the resumed talks. I wish I could tell you I would greet that with more confidence, but it remains a very, very conflictive, very contentious set of problems that does not appear at this stage from the outside to be on the edge of settlement as much as the U.S., Qatar, Egypt, and others are engaged in seeking to push it in that direction.
Well, on that note, Ambassador, if Hamas is not at the table tomorrow, do you believe that they will get there, or is this kind of the last chance to really get this done? If it doesn't happen this week, why would we have any faith that it will happen ever?
Kailey, the process of seeking peace in a place like the Middle East is not based on auguries of hope driving us on, but alternatives that are worse, that manufacture what I would call the impulsion to move ahead. And it's been arguable that in the Middle East conflict, despite the very high casualty rates and the massive range of destruction and the problems on both sides, we have not reached the point where the parties feel there is enough disadvantage to continuing the conflict to precipitate the beginning of a serious look to see whether they can gain more from negotiations than they can gain from further shooting.
Ambassador, of course, you were also ambassador to a number of other nations here that give you expertise on what's happening in the world, including Russia. And we're looking at Ukraine continue its incursion into Russian territory, an offensive that appears to be taking hold. Now about 2 weeks old, Russia last night had to knock down 117 drones from Ukraine. Is this something that could become a foothold for a wider offensive?
I think that we're in a situation in which many of us remain skeptical that there is a battlefield victory in sight, but intrigued by the notion that the Ukrainians have launched a set of military activities into Russian territory, which the Russians, with all of their undoubted strength and superiority, have not been able to dislodge. And that is the kind of setup one would expect to see, if it continues, become a potential basis for convincing one side or another that they have more to gain in negotiations than they have to gain in continued conflict. We'll wait and see. I think both President Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and perhaps politicians in this country as well, are very much engaged in the idea that in these conflicts they have more to gain from avoiding things like prosecution and so on, either for international criminal courts or for domestic courts, by continuing the conflict than by moving it into the negotiating process. And we have to be careful of that and watch that as one of the determining factors.
Well, so, Ambassador, do you see this Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory as something ultimately that does bring the war closer to its end than it was before, because either it makes Ukraine more likely to have victory outright, or at the very least, may bring negotiators to the table?
Kailey, that interpretation is not totally excluded, if I can be very cautious in saying it, but it is not something that I think is inevitable. But we have been looking in the Russia-Ukraine war for the idea that there does not seem to be at hand a military victory on the part of either side, despite both Russian larger capacity as a power on the one hand, and world continued support for Ukraine in the main on the other hand to tip the balance. But a Ukrainian success which can be sustained may begin to open the door to thinking on the other side, do I have more to lose by continuing the conflict or more to gain by negotiating a solution? And it is that set of capacities, if I could put it that way, of changes that often precede a negotiated outcome. But it is not certain, and it is not based on any estimation of how the parties and their leaders have acted up until now to expect that
Understood.
A negotiated solution is around the corner. It is potentially a slightly greater possibility than a few weeks ago, but far from a certainty.
Okay.
He was ambassador to Russia and U.S. ambassador to Israel. Thomas Pickering, we thank you so much for the insights today. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey, CPI Day, which has more to do with politics than ever as we get closer to Chicago and, of course, November, with a couple of important speeches happening this week on the campaign trail. We got a lot of speeches, Kailey, but these are ones we actually listen to for details. Today it's Donald Trump.
Yep.
Friday it's Kamala Harris. Actual economic plans that both owe voters, so we can tell how much difference there is here and whether there is a plan to lower prices.
Yeah, and both of these speeches will be given from the swing state of North Carolina, which is interesting. They're just 2 days apart, of course. But the question really is going to be, how specific do they get on the policy that they want to pursue? And frankly, how much overlap might there be? As we know on at least two issues, the child tax credit, which J.D. Vance is now out saying he is in favor of expanding, and taxing, or not taxing rather, tipped income.
Yes, right.
They agree. So where exactly, knowing that this administration Harris has been part of also has kept intact many of the tariffs from the Trump administration, where are the differences here?
You might get a little squinty-eyed, as Kailey likes to say, trying to tell the difference here. Look, it's not just the difference between these campaigns, Kailey. It's going to be the difference between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden.
Surely.
When she speaks on Friday. And now we're really splitting hairs. Potentially, we have a lot to hear from them.
And of course, before we hear from Harris on Friday, she will be sharing a stage with
just
President Biden in Maryland tomorrow, where they will be talking about their administration's efforts to lower costs for the American people in the aftermath of today's inflation data. So it's a lot that we're looking forward to. And I'm pleased to say joining us to talk about it as we look ahead is Bharat Ramamurti. He is Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project, also formerly Deputy Director of the National Economic Council at the White House. Bharat, always great to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could first begin with the data today, obviously we heard some similar words from Joe Biden about it, that it does show progress, that prices are still too high. When you see, looking at the data, still stickiness in shelter costs, for example, are you confident that prices can get materially lower between now and November?
Yeah, look, I think that CPI is on a really good trajectory. If you look at over the last 3 months, headline CPI is up only 0.4%. That's obviously actually below the Fed's target for annual inflation. The housing number is obviously driving the vast majority of the inflation that we still have. Some of that is lagged data. Some of that is does not reflect disinflation that's in the pipeline. So I actually think that it's a sign of, should be a sign of optimism that housing is the overwhelming force here. But I think it's incumbent upon both candidates to explain what they plan to do on housing. I think on that front, the Biden administration and the Harris campaign has talked a lot about putting significant federal dollars into building new affordable housing supply, which is ultimately the medium-term and long-term solution to the housing cost problems that we have.
Of course, what Kamala Harris could really use at this point is lower interest rates, helping young people maybe get a foothold in this housing market as policies move forward to build more homes. Bharat, I wonder what you think about this idea. You've actually worked in the White House with both of the people we're talking about here, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. the extent to which she needs to find her own message when she speaks to the economy on Friday, and maybe even find some sunlight between herself and Joe Biden to show a new approach at lowering prices. What could we hear on Friday?
I think ultimately what you're going to see is, to go to the point that you were making as we came into this segment, is to drive a contrast between the Harris economic agenda and the Trump economic agenda. Just to quibble with one thing you said on the child tax credit, it's great that J.D. Vance has nominally expressed some support for that. But if you look at when the bill that actually expanded the child tax credit was before the United States Senate, every single Republican senator voted against it. And denied us the ability to provide a little bit of tax relief to parents with children. So,
do we actually know if Donald Trump supports that? He's never said that.
I would suspect that he doesn't, to be totally honest, and that might be a bit of daylight between himself and his vice presidential nominee. And so, but I think what the Harris campaign is going to do, I suspect, is identify a few areas of emphasis where there's a really sharp contrast with the Trump economic agenda. Number one, on taxes. It's not just the child tax credit that we talked about. When it comes to fiscal responsibility and raising taxes on the very wealthy and large corporations, the Trump plan is clear. It's a $4.6 trillion tax cut that goes primarily to households making well over $400,000 a year. The Harris economic agenda, which comes out of the Biden-Harris budget, is to raise some taxes on the very wealthy and large corporations, help bring down the deficit by $2 trillion over the next 10 years, and at the same time provide some middle-class tax relief, something that's absent from the Trump economic plan. And so whether it's on taxes, whether it's on a willingness to actually stand up to corporate actors who are squeezing American families, where the vice president has a track record of that as Attorney General of California, Trump as president bent over backwards to do the bidding of corporations. And so I think you'll see a few areas of sharp contrast, and I think ultimately a case made by the Harris campaign that they are being more responsive to the actual concerns of American voters.
So while you may see sharp contrast in some areas, Bharat, there are at least similarities in others, including this idea on the subject of taxes and the deficit about not taxing tipped income. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that not doing that would increase the deficit by $100 to $200 billion over 10 years. Is this actually good economic policy?
I think, again, you have to put all of this into the context of a broader fiscal plan, a broader budget. I think when you put that plan alongside a policy to raise substantially more tax revenue from the very wealthy and large corporations and to ultimately drive down the budget deficit, which is what the Harris plan, the Harris Biden budget, it does, versus the Trump agenda, where this additional $100 or $200 billion in tax cuts comes on top of a $4.6 trillion tax cut that primarily goes to the wealthy. You can see how one is a reasonable set of policies that puts America on a better fiscal track, and one would massively blow out the deficit on top of, I should note, the $8 trillion of deficit increase that you saw in the first Trump term.
So on Friday, Kamala Harris gets on stage and says, look at the last 3 years of progress we've made. The Biden-Harris economic proposal moves forward if you elect me as president. Because if you look at the CPI today, 4 months straight of easing inflation, everybody expects rate cuts to start in September. This coincides pretty nicely with a November election, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've said before that I think you're hitting a patch of real economic momentum here with inflation clearly easing, where at this point, I think the question for the Fed in September is not whether they will cut, but whether they cut by 25 basis points or 50 basis points. That's going to be an important moment where I think it will send a signal to the American public we've officially turned the page on inflation. And so there's a lot of momentum in the economy.
Can she say that, though? Can she say that? Because everyone's asking about drawing contrast with Joe Biden. What if she just gets up there and says, we won the war against inflation? Is that mission accomplished 2024?
I'm not sure if she's going to use that exact language, but I do think that she's going to be able to ride a lot of positive economic data into the fall and into November. If everything stays on the current trajectory, that's going to be another boost to a campaign that's already done very, very well over the last couple of weeks in building the case for it. And so I think what she has an opportunity to do is to try to explain to the American public how her economic agenda is going to be responsive to the concerns that they are feeling in their lives today. Obviously, the cost of living is a big one, the cost of housing, the cost of childcare, the cost of higher education. But I also think part of it is who can create a calm, predictable atmosphere for businesses to thrive in. And what we saw during the first Trump term was chaos and uncertainty that I think really put a toll on the ability of businesses to conduct, to do their work on a daily basis. And with the Harris administration, I think you'll see a lot of regulatory predictability, a lot of working with the business community, especially the small business community, to make sure that they have the tools that they need to grow.
As we consider her economic policy, it is also pointing out she's been hit too on the border, specifically an issue with which Republicans are charging that as borders are, she essentially, to summarize, really messed things up. Can we separate migration, immigration policy from economic policy now, though, as Donald Trump is accusing her of taking a turn toward his kind of policy, hardening some of her language when it comes to migration, knowing the impact that it has had on growth on the labor market? Could that kind of more rightward shift, or at least harsher shift when it comes to the border and migration, actually be something that takes an economic toll?
Look, I think the president and the vice president from the very beginning of the administration have been talking about the need for comprehensive immigration reform that involves more border security, more funding for border patrol agents and so on, but also changes on legal immigration and a way of addressing all the folks, the dreamers that have been here in the United States, providing them with a pathway to citizenship. I think that's the right balance of steps to address some of the labor issues that you talked about, while at the same time making sure that we have a strong border and can enforce the rules that we have about crossing the border. I think that the vice president, if you look at the actual data, the administration has done a good job of addressing migration across the border. We saw that the steps that the president took a couple of months ago via executive order have led to a significant decrease in illegal crossings. But at the end of the day, this is an area where Congress needs to act. And we remember the Senate had a bipartisan proposal that the president and vice president supported, and that Donald Trump came in at the last second to urge Republicans to vote against it, in my view, because he would rather campaign on the issue than try to solve the problem.
Bharat, finally, before we let you go, and I do ask you this question knowing that you spent years working for Senator Elizabeth Warren, who certainly has thoughts about this industry, but Politico is reporting there is a Crypto for Harris event happening tonight in which a number of lawmakers are going to attend virtually, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. I'm not sure you expect to hear the vice president talk about crypto policy specifically on Friday when she's outlining economic policy, but do you expect she'll be very different than Joe Biden on that front?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. It's not something that I've talked to her or her team
Would you encourage her to be?
I think generally speaking, we should have innovation in the United States, and that we should have regulatory policies that encourage responsible innovation. At the same time, my view on crypto has been that we need to address some of the scams that have been taking advantage of consumers and causing real financial harm. We also need to look at steps we can take to insulate the broader financial system from any issues that may arise in the crypto space. And we need to do something to address money laundering and other ways of using crypto to evade the rules that we have for the rest of the financial system. I think that there are ways of doing that while at the same time creating an atmosphere that allows innovation to proceed. Obviously, the devil's in the details on how you strike that balance, but I think ultimately that should be the goal.
Bharat, it's great to have you back. Bharat Ramamurti, now with the senior advisor, I should say, for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project, formerly advising the Biden White House on the economy. Bharat Ramamurti, thank you. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.